April 17th, 2018. Red Willow County, Kansas. The wind came in low that morning, dragging dust across the fields like a warning nobody wanted to hear. At exactly 6:40 a.m., Sarah Whitaker stepped off her porch, walked past the rusted fence her father had welded by hand, and drove her old tractor straight into a field that everyone else had already given up on. By noon, half the town knew what she was doing. By evening, they were laughing. And by the end of that week, they were already placing quiet bets on how long it would take before she lost everything. Because Sarah Whitaker wasn't planting corn. She wasn't planting wheat. She was planting sunflowers on land that hadn't held moisture in over 3 years, on soil that cracked open like broken glass under the sun, and she was doing it alone. But the part that unsettled people wasn't just what she was planting. It was how certain she looked while doing it, and that made people uncomfortable. The first time she said it out loud was at the Red Willow Agricultural Hall 2 nights later. The room smelled like old wood coffee and dust that never really left. Farmers filled the benches, arms folded boots, heavy against the floor. At the front stood Richard Hale, the man who practically owned every loan in 3 counties. He adjusted his tie, glanced down at his notes, and then looked straight at Sarah. "So let me understand this," he said, voice loud enough to carry. "You intend to replace your entire acreage with sunflowers." A few chuckles started in the back. Sarah stood near the wall, hands resting loosely at her sides. She didn't move forward, didn't try to command attention. She just answered, "Yes," that was all. And for a moment there was silence. Then it broke. Not gently, not politely. Laughter rolled across the room like a storm. One man slapped his knee. Another shook his head. Someone muttered, "She's lost it," loud enough for others to hear. Richard smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "Miss Whitaker," he said, almost patient, "this isn't a hobby garden. This commercial farmland. That soil out there?" He gestured vaguely toward the horizon. "Can't even hold water anymore. And you want to plant a crop that isn't even in demand here?" Before Sarah could respond, another voice cut in. A man in a pressed shirt, clean boots. Too clean, leaned forward. Daniel Cross, an agricultural engineer from Lincoln, brought in by the county to advise struggling farms. "Sunflowers won't fix structural degradation," he said flatly. "If anything, you'll accelerate nutrient loss. You're not solving the problem, you're ignoring it." More nods, more agreement. And then came the moment nobody in that room forgot. A farmer near the front. Tom Garrison leaned back and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Her old man ran that land into the ground, and now she's finishing the job." This time the laughter was sharper, closer, directed. Sarah didn't flinch, but something in the room shifted, because humiliation doesn't always show on the outside. Sometimes it just settles deeper. Richard stepped forward, clasped. "You have 1 active loan remaining," he said, dropping just enough to sound serious. "If this season fails, and it will, we will have no choice but to reclaim the property." A pause, then softer, almost as if offering mercy. "You should consider selling while it still has value." That was the offer. That was the line in the dirt. And everyone in that room expected Sarah to argue, to defend herself, to say something. Instead, she simply nodded once, turned, and walked out. But there was something nobody noticed in that moment. Not Richard, not the engineer, not the farmers who had just laughed. Sarah wasn't leaving defeated. She was leaving, certain, and that certainty came from something buried far deeper than pride. Because this story didn't begin in that room, and it certainly didn't begin with sunflowers. It began long before that, with a man who almost never raised his voice, and a piece of land that most people would have abandoned decades ago. Sarah grew up on that same farm, under a sky that never seemed to end. The Whitaker land stretched just over 240 acres. Nothing impressive by commercial standards, but enough to keep a family alive if you knew how to listen to it. Her father, Daniel Whitaker, was not a man people argued with. Not because he was loud, but because he rarely spoke at all. He moved slowly, thought slowly, worked with a kind of patience that made other men uneasy, and he had a habit that Sarah never understood as a child. Every morning before sunrise, he would walk out into the fields and just stand there. No tools, no clipboard, no plan. Just stand. Come here. He once told her when she was 8 years old. She walked out barefoot, the dirt still cool beneath her feet. "What are we doing?" she asked. "Listening," she frowned. "To what?" He didn't answer right away. Then he crouched, pressed his hand into the soil, and said quietly, "To what's still alive." At the time it sounded like nothing. Years later, it would mean everything. Daniel Whitaker didn't farm like the others. He didn't chase yield charts or chemical shortcuts. While neighboring farms pushed for bigger harvests year after year, he rotated crops, left sections. Untouched, planted things people said didn't make money. "They're not growing food," one neighbor once said. "They're growing numbers." Daniel never responded, but his land responded for him. Even in dry seasons, it held longer. Even when others failed, something always came through. Until 2014. That year, the rains didn't come. Then they didn't come again. And again. 3 straight seasons of drought. Wells dropped lower. Soil hardened. Cracks formed wide enough to swallow seeds before they even had a chance. And something changed. Not just in the land, but in the people. Farmers who had worked side by side for decades began selling, leaving, letting go. Daniel didn't. He couldn't. Or maybe he wouldn't. By the time Sarah turned 27, the farm wasn't just struggling. It was collapsing. Loans piled up. Equipment broke down faster than it could be fixed. The old tractor, his tractor, became both lifeline and liability. And then one quiet morning in late September, Daniel Whitaker didn't come back from the field. A heart attack, they said. Quick, clean. But nothing about what came after felt clean. Sarah buried her father under an oak tree at the edge of the property, the same tree he used to sit under during the hottest hours of the day. And for a while, she didn't know what to do. Because grief doesn't come with instructions, and neither does land that's slowly dying. Most people expected her to sell. Some even offered to help. But Sarah stayed. Not because she had a plan, but because leaving felt like losing something she didn't yet understand. And then, about 6 weeks after the funeral, she found it. Not in the house, not in the barn, but in a narrow wooden chest tucked behind the old workbench, where her father used to repair parts that nobody else would bother fixing. Inside was a notebook, leather-bound, worn, edges curled from time. It didn't belong to her father. The handwriting was older, sharper, her grandfather's. At first glance, it looked like records, dates, crops, yields. But the deeper she read, the stranger it became. Observations about soil behavior, sketches of root systems, notes about seasons when nothing should have grown. But something did. And then she found the entry, dated July 1936. One line stood out underlined twice. When the land forgets how to live, plant what remembers how to reach. Below it, a single word. Sunflowers. Sarah didn't understand it all at once. Not the science, not the reasoning, but she understood something else. Her father had kept this, not as history, as instruction. And there was one more thing, something even more important, hidden between those pages. Something nobody in Red Willow, not the banker, not the engineer, not the farmers, had ever seen. And that detail would change everything. The first time people realized Sarah wasn't going to stop was not when the sunflowers sprouted. It was when the bank came back. 2 weeks after planting, a black pickup rolled slowly down her dirt road, kicking up a long trail of dust that hung in the air like something unfinished. Richard Hale stepped out, polished shoes sinking slightly into soil that barely held shape anymore. He didn't look around in admiration. He looked around like a man measuring loss. "You're still doing it," he said, glancing at the rows, long, straight lines of disturbed earth, stretching farther than most thought she'd commit to. Sarah was tightening a bolt on the old cedar attachment. She didn't stop working. Yes. Richard sighed, almost disappointed. I thought you'd come to your senses after the meeting. She wiped her hands on a cloth, then finally looked at him. This is me coming to my senses. That answer lingered longer than he expected, and for just a second, he didn't have a response. But men like Richard rarely stay silent for long. You're out of time, he said, voice firm again. The bank can extend credit based on risk. But this, he gestured toward the field. This isn't risk. This is refusal to adapt. There was a pause. Wind moved through the empty field, lifting dust into thin spirals. You've got one season, he added. After that, this land isn't yours anymore. He turned to leave, but Sarah spoke quiet, steady. You ever seen land come back? Richard stopped, slowly turned. Land doesn't come back, he said. It gets replaced. And then he got in his truck and drove off. But what he didn't understand, what nobody understood, was that Sarah wasn't trying to replace anything. She was trying to wake something up. And the key to that wasn't just in the seeds she planted. It was in something buried much deeper, something her father had left behind, without ever explaining it out loud. 3 nights after Richard's visit, Sarah returned to the old wooden chest. The notebook lay open under a single dim light, its pages filled with a kind of thinking that didn't belong to any textbook. At the back, there was an insert, loose pages folded carefully, not written by her grandfather. Different handwriting, sharper, more technical. Names, scribbled in the margin. One of them circled twice Dr. Elias Varn. That name didn't belong to anyone in Red Willow, and that was the first clue. Sarah read slowly, then again, and then a third time, because the first 2 didn't feel real. Notes about soil contamination, about trace metals left behind from an industrial operation that had shut down decades earlier, far enough away that nobody had connected it, but close enough to matter. And then the line that made everything click. Helianthus annus exhibits hyperaccumulation potential under stress conditions. She didn't know the words, not all of them, but she knew what her father had circled underneath. Pulls poison out of the ground. Sarah leaned back, the wood creaking beneath her weight, because suddenly, the past wasn't just history. It was a map. Her father hadn't just been stubborn. He had been preparing. And there was one more page, a diagram, hand-drawn, of a plow, not a standard one, longer blade, deeper reach, adjusted angle. At the top of the page, a note, standard machines stop too shallow. They stir the wound. They don't heal it. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, because she knew that design. She had seen it, touched it, used it. The old tractor, the one everyone laughed at, the one her father refused to replace. It wasn't just old, it was modified. Built for this, and that was the part nobody knew. Not the banker, not the engineer, not the men who laughed in that hall. Sarah hadn't just planted sunflowers. She had planted them, deeper than anyone thought possible, into soil nobody else could reach. And that difference would soon become impossible to ignore. The first sprouts appeared 12 days later, small, fragile, almost invisible, unless you were looking for them. Most people weren't, but a few were. Tom Garrison drove by early one morning, slowed his truck just enough to stare, then shook his head. They won't last, he muttered. 2 days later, Daniel Cross returned, stepping carefully between the rows, examining the spacing, the depth, the structure. This doesn't make sense, he said, crouching down, because the spacing was wrong, the pattern was wrong, and the depth was impossible for that kind of equipment. He stood up slowly, scanning the field again. What did you do differently? He asked. Sarah didn't answer right away. She adjusted her gloves, looked out over the rows. Same thing my father did, she said. That's not an answer. No, she said quietly. It never was. Daniel frowned, frustration building, because there's something about quiet confidence that unsettles people who rely on certainty. And right then, certainty was beginning to slip, because despite everything the textbook said, despite everything the data predicted, the plants were growing, and not just surviving, reaching, deeper than they should have, stronger than they had any right to be. And that was when the attention started to shift, slowly at first. A glance here, a conversation there, then more. Because in a town like Red Willow, people notice patterns. And when something doesn't fit, They keep watching, but they still laughed. Not as loudly, not as easily, but enough. Enough to convince themselves they were still right, because admitting otherwise would mean admitting they had missed something. And that's something people rarely do, especially when the answer has been standing quietly in front of them the whole time. But what they didn't realize was that this wasn't the turning point. Not yet. This was just the beginning of something much larger, because beneath those fields, something was changing, something nobody could see. And when it finally surfaced, it wouldn't just change Sarah's land. It would force the entire town to confront a truth they had ignored for years. By late August, the sky over Red Willow had turned the color of old steel, the kind of sky that doesn't promise rain, but threatens everything else. The wind picked up first, hot, dry, relentless. Then came the reports, fields failing across 3 counties, corn curling in on itself before it could even form ears, wheat turning brittle weeks too early, and something worse, something people didn't want to say out loud at first. The soil wasn't just dry anymore, it was dying. Daniel Cross was one of the first to confirm it. Samples came back from multiple farms, high levels of residual contamination buried beneath years of over-farming and groundwater shifts. It had been there longer than anyone realized. Slow, invisible, spreading, and now does time. What we're seeing, he said during an emergency meeting at the same agricultural hall, is systemic failure. This isn't just drought. The soil structure has collapsed. In some areas, it's toxic. The room was quieter this time. No laughter, no jokes, because suddenly, it wasn't just about one woman making a strange decision. It was about everyone. Richard Hale stood at the front again, but he didn't look as certain as before. "We'll work through this," he said, though his voice didn't carry the same weight. "There are federal programs, emergency restructuring," but even he knew. Programs don't fix dead land. And then someone said it, quietly, reluctantly. "What about Whitaker's field?" The room shifted. Heads turned, because nobody wanted to be the first to admit it. But everyone had seen it, driving past, looking without stopping. Her field with the view was green. Not struggling, not barely holding on. Green, alive. Daniel Cross cleared his throat. "I visited the site 3 days ago," he said. A pause, then carefully. "The soil composition is different." That was all he said. But it was enough, because in a town like Red Willow, people know when someone is leaving something out. And what he wasn't saying was louder than what he was. The first trucks arrived at Sarah's farm the next morning, not to laugh, not to watch, but to ask. Tom Garrison was the first to step out, hat in his hands, eyes lowered. "I was wrong," he said. "Simple, no excuses, no explanations. I need to know what you did." Behind him, more vehicles lined the dirt road. Men who had laughed, men who had turned away, men who had said she didn't understand the land, now standing quietly, waiting. Sarah looked at them for a long moment, then out across her field. Rows of tall sunflowers, their heads turned in unison toward a sun that had burned everything else away. "This isn't about the flowers," she said. They didn't understand. Not yet, but she stepped forward anyway, bent down, scooped a handful of soil. Dark, loose, holding together. "Your land is sick," she said. "Mine was too." Tom swallowed. "What changed?" Sarah looked up, and for the first time, there was something in her voice beyond quiet. There was something in the ground, she said. Something none of us wanted to see. She explained it then, not like a scientist, not like an engineer, but like someone who had lived it. The contamination, the years of buildup, the way it had slowly poisoned the soil beneath their feet. And then, the part that made the room still. "These," she said, gesturing to the towering sunflowers, "don't just grow. They pull silence. They pull what's killing the land out of it." No one spoke, because what she was saying wasn't in any meeting, wasn't in any report, wasn't in anything they had trusted. And then came the final piece. "The roots only reach that deep if you let them," she said. Daniel Cross stepped forward. "What do you mean?" Sarah glanced back toward the barn, toward the old tractor. "The ground was never the problem," she said quietly. "We just never went deep enough." That was the moment everything shifted, because suddenly, the machine they had laughed at mattered. The one they called obsolete, useless, outdated. It had been doing something none of their modern equipment could, reaching where they couldn't, fixing what they never knew was broken. 2 weeks later, the first full harvest came in. Not corn, not wheat, but something far more valuable. Proof. Independent tests confirmed it. Sarah's land, once classified as failing, now showed reduced contamination levels, improved structure, moisture retention. It didn't make sense, except it did, just not in the way they had been taught. And then came the real test. She planted again. This time not sunflowers, corn. Everyone watched, every row, every inch, because this was the part nobody could fake. And when the first shoots came up, strong, even healthy, no one laughed, not a single person. By mid-season, it was undeniable. Her yield outperformed every field in Red Willow. In the worst agricultural collapse the county had ever seen, Sarah Whitaker had the only farm that held. And that was when Richard Hale came back. Not in a truck, not standing tall. He walked, alone, stopped at the edge of her field, and for a long time, he didn't say anything, because some truths don't need words. Finally, he spoke. "I misjudged you." Sarah didn't respond. "I misjudged all of it," he added. Another pause, then quieter. "The foreclosure, it's off the table." She nodded once, not surprised, not triumphant, just accepting. And that was the part he didn't understand, because she wasn't interested in proving him wrong. She had been trying to prove something else right. The offers came quickly after that. Corporations, investors, numbers higher than anything her family had ever seen. Enough to walk away, enough to never worry again. But Sarah didn't sell. Instead, she did something nobody expected. She started helping, one farm at a time, sharing what she had learned, showing them how to work the land differently, how to listen again, even with the same old equipment, if you understood it. And slowly, Red Willow changed. Not overnight, not completely, but enough. Enough to remember what it had forgotten. Richard Hale didn't stay. Within a year, he was gone. Transferred. Replaced. Some said he requested it. Others said he didn't have a choice. But either way, he never came back. Daniel Cross did. Not as an expert, but as a student. And that might have been the biggest change of all. Years later, people would still talk about that season. The year everything failed. Except one field. They would talk about the sunflowers. About the old tractor, about the woman who didn't argue, didn't defend, didn't try to be right. She just worked, and when the time came, she let the land speak for her, because in the end, this was never about flowers. It was never about machines, and it was never about proving anyone wrong. It was about something simpler, something older, something most people forget until it's too late. Don't laugh at what you don't understand. Don't rush to replace what you've never truly listened to. And never mistake quiet knowledge for weakness, because sometimes the thing that looks the oldest, the simplest, the most outdated, is the only thing left that still knows how to save everything